Hello, and welcome to today's Laker lesson, part of our Research into Action series. I'm Venessa Keesler, an education consultant hired by Grand Valley Charter School office to bring you this series. And today we are focusing on classroom management. So as you know, if you've been watching our Research into Actions, you know that there's a few things we talk about research. One, research varies in quality. You want access to high quality research, but not all research is high quality. Another thing is, a lot of research focuses on correlations or associations. So as one thing increases, another thing increases, as opposed to cause and effect, where we know that if you do X, Y will happen. In education research, a lot of the research is about correlations. We can't ethically give some kids an intervention and not give it to others and hope, see what happens. We can't say, oh, we're going to give you good teaching and you bad teaching, and then we'll prove that good teaching is important. So a lot of education research does rely on correlational, association-based evidence, which is fine, but we just need to be clear about what kind of evidence we're looking at and what inferences we're making. The other thing to keep in mind is that research is science, so it's always evolving. We might talk about something today, some more research might happen, kids change, policy changes, and there might be more evidence to bring into the mix. That's why these Research into Actions that are brought to you by GVSU Charter School office are designed to bring you the best, most recent research evidence so that you can put it into practice without having to worry about, is it quality? What kind of association is it showing me? What's the latest? It's meant to make your lives easier as practitioners and bring you that evidence-based information that you need to guide your daily work. And Grand Valley conducts its own research as well and makes it available to you. And you can access that research at the QR code on your screen. That might be the easiest way. Or if you prefer, the website is gvsu.edu/CSO/research. So take a look, keep your eye there. They're always adding more evidence, more research, more information that you can use, and that is specific often to the GVSU Charter School portfolio. So what are you going to learn today? We are going to be diving into evidence-based classroom management practices. And I'm relying really heavily on an IES practice guide. We're going to talk more about that. But I have to say, out of all the research into actions, this has been the hardest one to do because classroom management is part of this large set of practices that includes routines and discipline, relationships, and then there's curriculum, there's institutional factors. So it's really hard to pull out classroom management and study it as its own thing. And that shows up in the research. People study, the implementation of this set of rules, or they study this program, but classroom management as the entire set of practices is a lot harder to wrap your hands around. I also am going to say a lot of the research I'm citing today feels a little bit old for me. That's from 2008, 2012, 2016. I was not able to find anything that I thought was really high quality after 2016. But one thing I did notice is that we're studying social emotional learning, trauma-informed practices, and I think that that's maybe a proxy for classroom management. I think not that social emotional learning is the same thing as classroom management, but I think the focus of research has shifted into understanding how we engage with kids in a way that isn't dubbed classroom management. So that's my hypothesis. That being said, I'm going to tell you what's out there. I think that this is all good information, and I think that it still is applicable to today's classrooms. I just want to acknowledge that normally I would like a little bit more recent evidence to bring forward. What the evidence-based classroom management practices are really coalesce around a few across several different pieces of evidence. So I'm pulling from this Kearns and Clemens work from 2007, from the Florida PBIS, MTSS work. They have a huge center down at University of South Florida around this. That's been around for a long time. So I'm going to walk you through these evidence-based practices, and then we'll get into the IES practice guide. So here are 5 evidence-based classroom management strategies. If you are a teacher and you've been teaching for any length of time, you probably are like, yes, I know these, I've heard this before, but these are evidence-based. Maximizing structure in the classroom. Teach, monitor, and reinforce expectations and rules. So what are the rules? What are the expectations? Make sure kids know them and reinforce them. Actively engaged students. We know that students who are engaged in learning or engaged in whatever activity you're doing are students who are less likely to get into trouble or find mischief. So active engagement helps with classroom management. And then implementing a continuum of classroom implemented strategies that acknowledge appropriate behavior and that respond to inappropriate behavior. That's the fifth practice. Breaking these down just a little bit more, and I do want to go through this in some level of detail. My hope is that if you are a practicing teacher and you're struggling with classroom management, there's something here that you're not doing, and you're like, oh, I can try that. Or if you're a newer teacher, you may not have been taught classroom management really explicitly in your teacher prep program. I know I wasn't. When I started as a teacher and I had my first classroom, I had to go to a more senior teacher and be like, how do I do this? How do I keep a grade book? What are the rules? And it was really helpful to have a mentor walk me through that. So hoping that this can be useful to somebody who's maybe at that stage in their practice as well. And again, this is all research-based. These things have been shown in research to be good practices to do around classroom management. So maximizing structure in the classroom means predictable routines and procedures. What's going to happen when, and where are the cues and signals so that kids know what the cue is that means the next thing is happening. And then some very practical things like minimizing crowding and distractions. So how do kids walk into the classroom? Are there places where they cluster? Is there any place in the classroom where you can't see the kids and there's not adequate supervision? Is there a space for staff separate from students, and how is that delineated? And then how do you have seating for various activities? And do the kids know that? Expectations and rules. It's funny, this is one of those things that it's been shown to help with classroom management, but it generally helps people in most facets of life to understand what are the rules and what are the expectations. And the clearer, the simpler, the more straightforward, the better. Those should be posted. You should teach them, model them, practice them, and then reinforce them. You may want to use formal lesson plans to teach the rules. And you also want to embed them into academics. So while you're doing academic lessons, be reinforcing the rules of the classroom. Actively engaged students. Again, students who are engaged, that's what we're going for. They learn more, they behave better. It's a better outcome for everybody. So some things, what that looks like in research is high rates of opportunities to respond. Are you giving kids a lot of opportunity to respond to what you're teaching? And we're going to dig into that more later in this presentation. Keeping an eye on task difficulty, so you are sure that all students have the skills to participate and you're not asking something that leaves out part of your classroom. Pacing and instructional momentum, keeping the pace going fairly quickly so kids have an opportunity to be presented with new material at a decent pace. And again, we're going to unpack that more in the practice guide. Instructional strategies. There's so many here, and this isn't a presentation on instructional strategies, but are you going to use group work? Are you going to use active instruction, passive instruction? Are you going to use technology? Are you going to use, practice, structured practice? Just really being creative with your instructional strategies and being intentional. So while I'm teaching this concept, I'm going to use this strategy because I think it'll help kids be actively engaged. And then making sure that the opportunities to respond, opportunities to participate, to use the materials, and to respond to requests are inclusive of all children in the class. So this might take a little bit of maybe having somebody watch you teach or some self-reflection. Are you asking things that only some kids can participate in? Or do some kids not have the right materials? Are you creating an inclusive classroom environment? Some of those strategies that help acknowledge appropriate behavior, the biggest one that comes up across all kinds of the research is this specific and contingent praise. So being really, good job with that task in this way, like very specific and contingent. And then also group contingencies. So how are you working as a group? The whole group did this. I'm going to give this praise to the group. Things like behavior contracts or token economies. This helps with the small rewards given frequently, which helps manage behavior, helps drive students toward appropriate behavior. So strategies to respond to inappropriate behavior. And I think it was interesting in the literature, and again, I think this is part of the shifting conversation around what management looks like, what discipline looks like in schools, and wanting to be more responsive, more inclusive, not necessarily just punishing. Like punitive approaches across a lot of things often are shown to be less effective. So inappropriate behavior, there is some error corrections like, oh, don't, try this instead of that. Pulling back on the reinforcement. So if you're reinforcing good behavior and someone is not doing it, they get less reinforcement. One of my favorite that came up with the research was planned ignoring, like sometimes just, not seeing what is happening or not engaging, because that creates a feedback loop that you don't want to be in as a teacher. And then again, that timeout from reinforcement. Maybe your inappropriate behavior means you can't participate in certain things. Again, I think it's interesting to think about behavior redirection versus classroom management. And I think there's a lot of conversation about the best ways to support student behavior in a positive way. But these were some of the classroom management strategies to help with that reductions in inappropriate behavior. So that was a very quick overview, and now I want to turn to the IES practice guide. So what is this? The Institute for Education Sciences is the federal agency charged with producing evidence-based information for education. So they conduct studies, and they have something called the What Works Clearinghouse that reviews studies for levels of evidence. I would say that IES is like the gold standard of research and evidence. So when they produce these practice guides, they are really using a very high standard for what is that quality of research. And then even when they determine a study is quality, like meets scientific rigor, they still evaluate the evidence produced by every study. And so they produce these practice guides where they say, hey, listen, we know that you as educators need the best information that's out there. Not all things will have the strongest level of evidence, but you still need good evidence from good studies. And so they make these practice guides, which have recommendations, and then it indicates how strong the evidence is for each recommendation. So this guide has 5 recommendations around classroom management. 2 of them have strong evidence, and 3 have moderate evidence. So that's a pretty good evidence for these strategies. What I like the best about these guides is that while they are very research-based and rigorous, they also are really practical. They have checklists, they have roadblocks and suggestions, they have implementation information. So I would really encourage you to take a look at this. Again, it is from 2008, which is not as new as I would like, but they haven't updated it since then. There was no newer version of it, which suggests that this still holds, and they do review these, so there's some safety net there that this is still good information. The other thing that IES does is they're very specific. So for this, they limited the studies they reviewed to studies in elementary schools. And so they're like, this is only for elementary schools. When you look through the guide, you'll see that I think the practices apply to middle school and high school as well, but because they didn't explicitly study it in middle school or high school, they wanted to say, well, we can only be sure that this is for elementary schools. So take that with a grain of salt. These are the 5 recommendations from the IES practice guide. 1, identify the specifics of the problem behavior and the conditions that prompt and reinforce it. 2, modify the classroom learning environment to decrease problem behavior. 3, teach and reinforce new skills to increase appropriate behavior and preserve a positive classroom environment. 4, draw on relationships with professional colleagues and students' families for continued guidance and support. And 5, use school-wide strategies where appropriate. You will see a lot of alignment between these recommendations and the ones we just talked about, but there's a couple new ones and there's some more detail, so I want to go through these separately. So identify the specifics of the problem behavior and the conditions that prompt and reinforce it. This recommendation gets you focused on understanding what's happening around behavior, what's happening in the classroom, and what is the impact on learning. So starting by concretely describing the behavior problem and the effect it's having on the learning environment. Thinking about things like cultural differences, students' academic behavioral skill set, trauma, understand the problem with a more holistic lens. Observe and record the frequency and the context of the problem behavior. So do a little bit of data collection. Take some notes on what is happening, when, where is it, what's happening during the behavior issue. When is the class getting out of control? Why is that happening? Do some simple data collection. Don't overdo it on the data collection. This could turn into a whole data collection effort, but do keep track one behavior and see if you can determine any patterns. And then try to figure out what prompts and what reinforces the problem behavior. Is it happening during certain parts in the curriculum? Is it only during math? Is it during social emotional learning? Like, when's it happening? What's happening socially and what's happening in the setting? And then think about how to modify the classroom learning environment to decrease that problem behavior. So again, in this recommendation, the practice guide brings forward the importance of revisiting, repracticing, and reinforcing classroom behavioral expectations. So teaching them at the beginning of the year, and then they get more explicit about the guidelines you need. So think of this as a checklist. Do you have guidelines for arriving at, leaving the classroom, for distributing materials, for turning in assignments, for requesting help from the teacher, transitioning to new activities or settings, experiencing interruptions, working independently, working in groups? So if you're a teacher, I know I went through those pretty quickly, but do you have actual guidelines for your kids? Do they know what to do in all those situations? Modify the classroom environment to encourage instructional momentum. So I said we'd get into this in more detail. You want to have a plan for how you're doing instruction in a way that keeps the momentum going. So scheduling academically demanding activities when the engagement is high, interspersing easy tasks between harder tasks, so there's a little bit of a cognitive load decrease for a minute. I mentioned this already, but matching the teaching strategy to lesson. So thinking really strategically when you do your lesson plans, what am I going to teach? How long? What's the pacing? What strategy am I going to use? And this might be if you're a younger teacher or a newer teacher, or even if you're a veteran teacher, this is a great place to collaborate with colleagues and say, well, what's your favorite way to teach fractions? Or like, what kind of engagement strategy do you use when you're doing writing? When you can, offer student choice in how they participate in learning. That is, throughout research, shown student choice helps kids pick the strategy, pick the learning that works for them, which makes them more bought into their learning. Manage those transitions, like we talked about. Even within a lesson, how are you transitioning from the starting task to the middle task to the end? And then think about the physical environment. Is it set up for success? Is it too hot, too cold, too crowded? And that's not always easy to control as a teacher, but those are things that do help with decreasing problem behavior when you take those into consideration. Adapt or vary your instructional strategies. So the practice guide here gets very specific, and they looked at the research for this. They didn't just come up with this. The research shows that the best rate of instruction is 4 to 6 responses per minute from students during the presentation of new material with an 80% accuracy rate. So again, you're teaching, you're asking, you raise your hand or say yes or no or whatever, voting, whatever engagement strategy you're using. You want about 4 to 6, and you want them to be about 80% right. I would be curious if you did a little data collection in your class, like is this how you do it? What is your rate of instruction? And see if you're faster, slower. See if this evidence holds up in your classroom. The research does show that a brisk pace of instruction helps with on-task behavior and student engagement. And that new materials should be presented with modeling, guided practice, and then independent practice. This is pretty traditional teaching lineup, but first you show them how to do it, then you have them do it with you watching, then you have them do it on their own. And the guide has this implementation suggestion: just make one strategic change in one setting and assess the benefit. So this is a lot of ideas. You don't have to do them all at once. You probably shouldn't, but pick one, do it with fidelity, and see how behavior improves. Their third recommendation is teach and reinforce new skills to increase appropriate behavior and preserve a positive school climate. So I like that the practice guide expands on this idea of increasing appropriate behavior and broadens it a little bit. So this idea of thinking about where students might need explicit instruction for appropriate behavior. And one of the ideas in the guide is a self-monitoring checklist for students, like, did I do my pre-writing? Did I get my pencil? Like, whatever's on the checklist. Not assuming that students understand what appropriate behavior is and give them tools to know what appropriate behavior is. And then teaching skills by providing examples, practice, and feedback. And so some of the skills that we want kids learning in, again, this is for elementary, but I could see this being useful for middle school and high school too. Like, how do you gain attention from your teacher? How do you gain attention from your peers? How do you work in group settings? How do you self-manage your social behavior and academic tasks? I mean, if middle schoolers and high schoolers don't need to work on that, I don't Of course they do. And how do you develop emotional awareness? So again, using these strategies of explaining the appropriate behavior, break it down into concrete steps, model the skill, offer those opportunities for guided and independent practice, give feedback, specific feedback, and reinforce it over time. In the same recommendation, manage consequences, so reinforcers are provided for appropriate behavior and withheld for inappropriate behavior. And again, they get into small rewards frequently rather than large rewards infrequently, rewards quickly after the behavior. We've all heard this, but I think it bears repeating. Remember that we're rewarding the behavior, not the individual. So it's not about Johnny is good. It's Johnny, you did a good job with this task, or your listening is really on point right now, and use different kinds of rewards. And then their recommendation was simply withholding reinforcers for inappropriate behavior. Again, there's a whole separate about discipline, significantly inappropriate behavior that is a little bit different than just within the classroom management and trying to focus on a well-run classroom that I'm not going to totally get into here, but knowing that withholding reinforcers is not the whole spectrum of what you need to do with students sometimes, and that might be maybe that's another research into action. Their fourth recommendation was to draw in relationships with your colleagues and students' families. So the research shows that when you collaborate with other teachers, it helps with outcomes. That's true of both behavior management and professional practice. Building those collaborative relationships and partnerships with the school and district and community behavior experts, and then encouraging parent-family member participation and partnership. These are things that educators think about all the time. They're easy to write on a slide and hard to do, but just know that they are part of positive classroom management, and if you are working on them, which I'm sure you are, that's a good use of your time. And then their last recommendation in the practice guide is to consider when school-wide programs are needed. So some behavior is more school-wide than classroom-based and is best addressed with school-wide behavior with the school improvement team, or in Michigan specifically through your MyKIP, Michigan's Integrated Continuous Improvement Process, your MyKIP plan. You should be looking at school-wide behavior and thinking about school-wide approaches. GVSU Charter School Office has another research into action on school counselors that gets into some of the ways that school counselors can help with school-wide behavior, with academic development, social emotional development, and post-secondary transitions. You might want to watch that for some additional information. To know if you need a school-wide program, you're going to want to be looking at your data and information, and then if you do choose to use a school-wide strategy, you'd want to monitor implementation and make sure you allow time for the program to work. We've all heard this, but education suffers from it's not working, let's try something different. And you have to allow for the implementation curve. You have to let something be implemented for long enough to see if it actually worked. Is it just a transition, or is it that this program isn't effective for us? Okay, that was a lot. So a couple practical next steps. I always encourage you to think about this. Start with one thing. What's one thing you heard in this presentation that you could improve in terms of your classroom management, or one thing you heard that you want to revisit? So you're like, oh yeah, I haven't been really revisiting expectations with my kids like I wanted to, or I'm a school leader, I'm really not sure how my teachers are teaching certain skills, whatnot. So think of one thing and do that one thing. It's easy in education to feel like there's so many things, I can't do them all. So do one thing. Whatever that is that you do, implement it with consistency and monitor for results. And then for the school leaders who are watching, ask yourself a couple questions. Do your teachers have an opportunity to collaborate with other teachers around classroom management? Are there school-wide behavior issues that could be supported by school-wide behavior management practices? And are you supporting your teachers in receiving professional learning in classroom management? There is another research into action on the importance of professional learning and instructional coaching, and we cannot underscore enough that ongoing embedded professional learning is critically important. And that's what this next slide says as well. We really need to keep moving beyond train and hope and move into professional development that's intensive, ongoing, aligned with other school initiatives, and where there's that opportunity for coaching. Especially around something like classroom management, it will be really hard for your teachers to see clearly everything that they're doing around classroom management, where their blind spots are, what they might need some additional help with. So coaching, non-evaluative observation, really important for teachers to improve their practice. And finally, I just want to highlight the resources again. Like I said, the What Works Clearinghouse is always there on all kinds of topics. You can look things up. I referenced a couple seminal studies, the Kearns and Clemens and the Florida State work. And then we already talked about the IES practice guide. So if you were going to look at one resource from today, I would definitely encourage you to download the IES practice guide. It has a lot more information in it and checklists, things you can use when you do your one thing. What's the one thing the practice guide could help you? Thank you.